Alright, so let's talk a little bit about attributes. So I made a new scene and I'm going to, well, let's make an empty geometry node. Let's make a grid inside of here. Alright, and let's make it maybe 20 by 20. So we have a little bit more stuff to work with. Okay, so we're going to make attributes on this grid. As I already explained in a previous video, there's attributes can be on multiple elements inside of Houdini. So if we go to our geometry spreadsheet over here, we can have point attributes, we can have vertex attributes, we can have primitive attributes, and we can have detail attributes. So attributes can also be of a certain type. So let's look at this. So there's more than these four, but these are the main ones. So you can have a float attribute, which is basically just a number with a decimal. So let's say 1.0. It can also be 1.1, 1.315, whatever. You can have an integer attribute, has no decimals. So just 1, 2, 3, 4, 999, 9000, whatever. You can have a vector, which is 3 floats. So that's, for example, used to for a color, for example, because you have R, G, and B. So red, green, and blue. You have something like a normal, so something that has a direction will be a vector. And there's also a string, so just a string of letters. So cheese, for example, would be a string, but also a path on disk. So if you point to it, let's say a texture, for example, that would be a string because it's gonna point to a path on your disk. Or like, let's say you give something a name, then it will also be a string. So there's more types than just these. There's also there's also matrices, there's quaternions, but we're not gonna go into that just yet. That's just well, that's for later. So in general, there's these attributes, and we can create those like a lot of different ways. But let's say we just type attribute create. So you can see attribute create. Let's put it down and let's connect it. And let's just for now just go into our geometry spreadsheet so we can just see what we do. And we already see a something appear here, and it's called attribute 1, and it's set to 0. So every point is an attribute here set to 0. And it's a point attribute because this is set to create something on points. You can see on here attribute 1 class point. If I put this to primitive, for example, and I go to the primitive tab here, you can see now it's on primitives. Let's put it back to points, and now it's back on points. So you can just fill this up with whatever you want. And the interface of this thing is a little bit confusing because you see all these empty numbers here. And these are not used if you're just using one float. So this is now one float. You can see 0.1. So for example, in the value here, I can say if I could put it to 1.1, you can see everything will be 1.1. If I type something here, nothing will appear because the size is set to 1. So it's one float. If I put it to 2, you can see it makes 2 floats, which have an index. So attribute 1, 0, and attribute 1, 1. We're not going to do that for now. Just a little bit too confusing. But we can just type values in here. And just remember that like these are only used, let's say if we want to make a vector, for example. So let's make a vector. So if I put this to, so right now it's set to float. You can see our most important ones are on here. Let's make it vector. So now you can see we get 3 components. So component X, component Y, component Z, just like our position, right? X, Y, Z. So now our attribute X has 3. Our attribute Y is 0, but we can put it to 1. And attribute Z, we can put it to whatever we want. It can also be negative. So let's maybe go back to our scene view. And let's maybe show, like, for example, what an attribute could be. So let's remove our attribute create. Let's put down a color. So color will create a vector attribute called CD. So if we go back in our geometry spreadsheet, you can see an attribute appear CD. So CD is for color. So that's the Houdini color attribute. So right now this is white, so it's 1, 1, 1. Let's say if we put it to 1, 0, 0, you can see it's red because only the red is populated. And if we go to our scene view, we can see our grid is now red because Houdini recognizes this as an attribute called color and called CD, and that will show it as being color. So what I can also do is I can put this instead of constant color, let's put it to random. So now you can see I get a whole bunch of random colors. So what would that look like in our geometry spreadsheet? Well, if we go in here, you can see every point has just a random value between 0 and 1. So if you randomize something, it will always be between 0 and 1. And that's what we're going to do in Houdini. Anyway, we're always going to try to work between 0 and 1 because it's just the easiest to always work within a 0 to 1 space. But more about that later. Now we get these colors on the points. So if we zoom in a little bit, like every color here has a, so every point has a different color. That's also why it sort of gets this, this sort of blended look. If we were to point this to primitive, so primitive color, you can see now it gets more of a pixelated look because now every primitive gets its, just gets its own unique color. If we put it to vertex, you can see every vertex will get a unique color. So now we get sort of a pixelated gradient look. If we go into our geometry spreadsheet, you can see these colors appear. So we can write attributes onto our objects. And again, we can also do this based on other techniques that we have already learned. So I could make a group and I could put it to bounding regions, bounding sphere. So let's say bounding sphere. Let's group points, and then we can put the color to only be applied to our points. Now you can see we only see it where our points are. Now if we move this, see we move our points. So now everything, so the attribute will still, let's see, we have it to do, let's put it to points. So the attribute will still be on all of the other points because it needs to, it will always be on all the points, but it will just like default to like 0 or 1 if you don't specifically apply it to something else. So right now it will default to 1, and only other ones will be overwritten with this group node. So you can see if I move it around, I can apply color, and I could also I can also make this a primitive group, for example, and put this to primitive color, and you can see now it's sort of similar. So I can make this bigger, and now I'm applying colors selectively to where I want. All right, so that's a color attribute. So let's remove that, but we can also make our own attribute. So let's say put down another attribute random, put down an attribute randomize. And what that will do is, so by default it's set to color again, and we get exactly the same thing we had when we put the color to randomize. But we can also give this a name. So maybe call this Z-scale. Now you see the colors disappear. Go in here, and we want to make it one-dimensional. So put it to 1 dimension, and this will randomize between 0 and 1. So you can see if I put this higher, you can see it will randomize from 0 to whatever I put in here. So now all of these things will get a sort of a random Z-scale value, basically. You can, if you hover over here, you can see we have a Z-scale attribute. So with middle mouse, you can open up this window, or you could press the little I button here, and then this opens up. And then you have your Z-scale attribute here. You can see if we click on it, we make sort of a visualizer to sort of visualize this. And then if you press D, so if you press D in the viewport, we're going to do this later, but go to visualize, you can see it made sort of a visualizer in the viewport here, which you can also change. So right now it's set to ramp this color thing, but don't worry about this, but I'm going to delete it again. But yes, anyways, you can visualize something like that. But let's not visualize it that way. Let's use this attribute. So we have this point attribute called zscale, but we don't want it to be a point attribute. We want it to maybe be a primitive attribute. So let's put it to primitives, because we want it to be on every primitive. So now we have a primitive attribute for zscale. And if we want to visualize this ourselves, we could also like do it a different way. You could put it to color, ramp from attribute, and call it zscale. And put it to primitive. And now you can see we have our values as black and white values. Right, so now we can at least see what this is. So in here we see it as a, just as a representation for our primitive numbers. But again, these numbers here correspond to our primitive numbers if we were to put on the primitive numbers here. Simple enough. But we can use this attribute that we created to use some of our other nodes that we learned about already. So let's put down a poly extrude, for example. Connect it. Let's highlight it, and let's put the distance way up. So now it's just extruding this entire thing. All right. So what we can also do is like, let's go to local control. So that's just, you have these tabs here, put it to local control. And you have a distance scale in here. And it's, you can see that's grayed out now, but it's set to Z scale. So let's say if I enable this, nothing happens. Why doesn't anything happen? It's because it's extruding this whole thing as an entire piece right now. So we can also put it to, instead of connected components, let's put it to individual elements. So then it's going to individually extrude all of these things. And now you can see that we're actually extruding our objects based on our attribute. So we created a random attribute in here that is then extruding our grid. And this doesn't have to be called zscale. Attributes are just complete, it's just data and it's just a name. You can see we can type something else in here. So if we were to type cheese in here, go back. So right now it's not doing anything because we don't have an attribute called cheese. But if we call our attribute in here, zscale, if we type it, call it cheese, you can see it will work. And then of course we'd also need to do it inside of our color. So this is just an arbitrary name, which we can use inside of our poly extrude. And just by default, it's set to be called zscale, but you could call it whatever you want. So about these attributes, let's track back a little bit. And for example, let's make another object. Let's make a sphere. And let's create an attribute for this. And let's maybe call this zscale again, because it just makes a little bit more sense. So I'm just going to put zscale again everywhere. Okay. So this sphere is called, has an attribute called attribute 1 now. Maybe we also want to call it zscale. And let's also give it a color. Just for now, for visualization. Let's maybe make it red. So highlight it and maybe make it a red color. You can also click on here and then just like make any color you want. Just gonna make it red. All right. And then what we can do, for example, is we can transfer this attribute onto our grid. So let's make, if we type attribute transfer. So if you type A and then trans, then this will come up. Attribute transfer. Okay. So let's put this under our grid. And then in the second input, we can put our sphere. And then on the attribute transfer, we can say, what do we want to transfer? Okay, so I want this to be primitive color maybe instead of point color. And this needs to be a primitive attribute because we're going to use it later for the zscale again. So remember, the class on like where you put it on is going to be important depending on what you want to manipulate. Anyway, so let's put the transfer. You can already see that my grid now turned red. So why did it entirely turn red? Well, by default, it always just transfers anything, but we can also specify what we want to transfer. So I just put it to Z-scale. You see it turns white again, because right now it's not transferring the color, but we also want to transfer the color. So do it like that. We don't really have anything for positions we want to transfer. Let's just turn that off. Right, so if we go into conditions, we see a distance threshold, and by default it's set to 10. If we make it smaller, you can see, oh, what are we doing now? We are transferring, based on the distance, our attribute from our sphere. So if we move our sphere, and there's actually a slider also here as well, the blend width. So what that would do, and it doesn't work right now because we don't have any color on our grid before. So it doesn't have anything to blend with, because if we go to our grid here, this doesn't have any primitive color. So it doesn't know what to blend with. So let's also put a copy our color. Let's put it under our grid. Let's make it black. Right, so now we have a black grid. And now if we transfer and we up the blend width, you can see, oh, we get something going from 1 to 0. And again, this is just like based on where our sphere is. And if I go in geometry spreadsheet, you can see that like our color is ramping down based on where our sphere is. But it's not just doing it with our color, it's also doing it with our Z-scale. So let's turn off our randomization for our Z-scale for now. And let's turn off our color for now. So if you press the yellow thing here, you disable a node. And now if we go to poly extrude, and let's see, why is this not working? Let's go to, oh yeah, we had it set to, is it not set correctly? Let me just figure out why this is not working. Oh yeah, because it doesn't have a Z-scale attribute. So we also need Z-scale attribute on our grid. Right, so now it's gonna probably work. Still not. So why is it not? Oh yeah, we need to put the Z-scale to 0, and then over here it needs to be 1, because we cannot really so this was also set to 0, so it was just transferring 0 to 0. So anyway, if we now put up our poly extrude, you can see this thing moved up. So now we're extruding. So we're adding color, and then we're adding the Z-scale. So I can now move my sphere, and you can see, whoa, it's doing some cool extrusion effect. And so it's moving in when this thing comes in, and then it's gonna go down. And it's doing it very evenly. Maybe we want to make this a little bit more interesting by have it be a little bit more randomized. So we had this randomized here, right? If we enable this, you can see the whole thing will be randomized again. But similar to what the group node did, is there's a, we can, so right now it's overriding it. What we can also do is, if we have operation, I can set it to add value, or I can say to multiply. So if I put it to multiply, it will randomize for every primitive. So create a 0 to 1 value for every primitive, and it will multiply the value that's already there. So then we get this super cool I guess you could use this for some kind of a data effect or something like this. And maybe I think I want to just turn off the color. So I guess let's just turn off the color here. And you have of course you have your control over, and you can see this has has an error, a little error. That's because we don't have any color anymore. So if I were to remove this, you can see that disappears. So you can see how you can use attributes to to drive elements inside of Houdini. And you have all of these options here to do whatever you want. That's cool, right? And I could animate this if I want, for example. So let me show you how you can like do some animation inside of Houdini. So we're gonna go into this a little bit more later, but let's put down a transform. Let's maybe zero out our position on our sphere. So let's put it to, make sure that it's in the center. So 0, 0, 0. And then let's put a transform underneath it. And now let's transform it with our transform. And maybe let's template our grid so we can see where our grid is. Right. So now with this transform, let's move our sphere to the left. And then maybe we want to set a keyframe. So how you can set a keyframe is holding Alt and then clicking what you want to keyframe. So let's say I only want to keyframe the X. I can click on X and then it will set a keyframe. And now let's move along in the time. So let's say I'm going to move to frame 96. Move the sphere to the right here and then click. So you can see now my sphere will move. If I want to animate all of my channels at once, I could click on translate and then we'll set keys for every channel at once. So you can see right now I animated my sphere. So if I now go to our extrude down here, you can see it's extruding. So there's more animation controls as well. So it's like we could whatever. So scale is not going to work in this instance because this is just, if it's set to primitive, it will be treated as a point. So that's more for later. But let's say if we wanna change the animation, for example, if you wanna, let's say, remove your animation keys again, what you can do is right click and then delete channels. So now our animation is gone. If we want to change the graph of our animation, if you hold Shift and then click this, you can see it opens up a graph editor and we can sort of move our keyframes around. So here with the graphs, or if you use the dope sheet, you can just see it as keys and you can move it around like that. So we could, like, for example, have it sort of ramp in. So if I play, it's gonna ramp in like that. And by default, Houdini will just play back as fast as it can, as your computer can handle. If you want to play back real time, or at least if your viewport can handle it, you press the little real time toggle down here. You press play. You can see. Whoop. Now we created a really cool extrude type of effect. You can see right now it will just continue playing after this. You have this time slider down here on the bottom. We can drag this in a little bit. And we could say that it should just repeat after frame 100. Now we will just repeat. And there we go. And maybe we want our sphere to be a little bit more close when we start. Maybe start over there, just override the keyframe. Cool, right? So now we created, like, what we basically did is we created we created an attribute, and we transferred that attribute to another object. Then we randomized it a little bit with the attribute randomize, and then we use it to extrude it. And this use of data, like taking data, using it, and then applying it somewhere, and then using it to drive certain parameters, that's the big thing behind Houdini. And that's where we're going to go more into in the next video.